My name is Nora Hale. I'm 31 and right now I'm standing under the bright lights of a crowded town hall while my older brother jerks the microphone out of my reach and calls me emotional. A woman in a smart jacket with a company logo shuffles papers like this meeting is already decided. My other brother leans in toward a developer I've seen hover around the station and points at me like I'm a loose bolt they mean to tighten. A local reporter lifts her phone. Ray Collins, the county engineer, folds his arms in that way he does when he wants to look calm, but what I see is worry. I set Dad's yellowed letter and a stack of maps on the table. I hit play on my phone. A recorded voice says, "Sell now or watch the county shut you down," and it echoes under the fluorescent lights. The room turns on them, then on me. The vice president's face goes white, the developer slides like a man hearing a siren. I lean forward and say, "Here are my terms, and here is what they did." The room goes quiet enough that I can hear my own pulse. Before I tell you everything that led to this, before I tell you how I turned their quiet pressure into a public reckoning, leave a note where you're listening from in the comments. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I read every single comment and I'll answer the ones that sound like people scratching their heads about family and fairness. The station sits off a tired stretch of highway that got its own map in the book years ago. Bypasses moved the rush, but not the people who stayed. The paint peels in long, sun-creased strips. Inside, the soda cooler hums like a small engine and the coffee maker spits steam like a stubborn car that won't turn over. I run 2 lifts, a hoist, a compressor that wheezes on hot afternoons, and a coffee pot that's seen better days. I learned most of it by leaning over Dad's shoulder, by watching him tuck his thumb into the ring of a wrench and talk to a car the way some folks talk to dogs, soft and patient. I have a night school engineering degree rolled in a drawer that I never brag about. My hands still remember how to feel a hairline crack in a shaft just by touch. I wake early for farm pickups and stay late to run diagnostics on overheating computers that the summer heat makes stubborn. Everything around me smells like rubber and solvent and metal warmed by sun, familiar as a lullaby and sticky with oil. I keep a stool by the glass office window where Dad used to drink his coffee and mark appointments with a red pencil. He kept that pencil in his pocket like a talisman. Red was for things that mattered. The back lot is a tangle of weeds and scrap and a rusting frame I paid no mind to until last week, until I started following the marks he left. I sleep in a small apartment above the office. The ceiling fan clicks in a steady rhythm. My boots sit by the door. The radio hums low at night. Invoices live under a magnet on the fridge, and the night light by the sink is a little scuffed from years of fingers. I have a cheap mattress that sags where I do and a lamp that throws a yellow pool of light over Dad's old ledger on my kitchen table. My central lack isn't muscle or grit, it's recognition. My brothers have clean desks and cleaner suits. They think the station is nostalgia and a bill I should sign away. I know its worth in bolts that don't strip and in folks who come back because I tell them straight what something will cost. That honesty matters to me. It's what Dad taught me. It's what I sleep on. When Dad died, he left me the station, the land under it, and a desk he told me to open when the sun is honest. He didn't leave a big savings account or a pile of money. He left tools with worn handles, old surveys folded at odd angles, and a battered safe that used to sit under his desk with a key missing. The tax bill for the property is due, a compressor is squealing like a tired man, and the roof needs patching after the last storm. Mom's gone, she left us before the debts did, and I still say Mom and Dad like the words are a pair of work gloves. The house and what was in it got taken years ago to cover medical bills. My brothers called with condolences and offers that sounded like numbers. Tyler wanted a quick sale, Scott sent a lawyerly spreadsheet showing profit. They expected a check split 3 ways and a story about family legacy on a Saturday puff piece. Instead, I told them I wasn't selling. Aunt Linda phoned with soft words and a harder message. Sell now, move on, don't let the family name look shabby in front of folks. The will stung them because they'd planned the sale in their heads before Dad was even cold. He must have known he'd always liked to hold his cards close. I promised myself I'd read everything Dad left me before I made any decision. I promised I'd not let pretty smiles and faster hands push me off my own land. My brothers have pictures in glossy brochures that make everything shine. Tyler, the older one, sells dreams that come with staged kitchens and artful lighting. He keeps his hair the way a magazine keeps a model's. He talks in talk that smells faintly of new carpet and commissions. Scott wears suits like armor. He speaks in clean, polished sentences that line up like soldiers. They measure worth by sale price and square footage, by how a sign will read on a busy morning. They like the idea of legacy when legacy equals a framed photograph and a check. They call the station nostalgia and a liability and tell me, in tones that suppose they're doing me a favor, that it's time to step into opportunity, which means I hand the keys over and they handle the future. They've been out of town for years, out of the grit and the coffee rings. They didn't sit in the early dawn with a farmer whose truck wouldn't start. They didn't patch the roof in the rain because the job had to be done. They don't see the people who count on us. I measure worth in bolts that don't strip and neighbors who knock on the office window to ask if I can squeeze them in. They think I'm the kid sister who doesn't know business. I'm done letting that be my role in their story. Maddie is 14 and she's my small, stubborn miracle. She shows up after school with her braids tucked under a cap and a notebook full of doodled engines. She's the one who asks me how engines breathe and listens like every answer might be a secret. She's never been impressed by polished words. She watches me change oil and reads numbers off a gauge the way other kids read song lyrics. Her dad, Tyler, wants her to learn how to smile for the camera, how to sell a house with a handshake. I want her to understand how things hold together and how to fix them when they don't. I teach her torque in plain words and show her how to check oil with a stick and how to listen for a small, worrying sound that means trouble is coming. She sits on the grease-stained stool and asks questions about engines and about people. And she surprised me the first time she called me Aunt Nora, you fix things. That sentence landed in my chest and stayed there like a small, insistent heat. I promised her I'd keep her out of fights her uncles started and that I'd make room for her curiosity. She's pulled between the shiny promise her dad offers and the messy, honest work at the station. I won't drag her into a fight she didn't start. I'll teach her to stand at the bench and clean apart until it looks new again. That, for both of us, feels like keeping faith with Dad. Dad had rules that fit on a small scrap of paper in my head. No shortcuts on safety. Tell people the truth about a job and don't pad the price. Know your neighbor's name and answer a knock if you can. He kept a red pencil in his pocket and used it like a compass. Circle what mattered, dot what needed following, cross out what was a lie. He preferred nods to speeches. If he made a deal, you knew because he walked the distance, not because he announced it in a meeting. He liked maps and numbers but hated bragging. He'd say, "We don't make promises we can't keep," and then make quiet promises that lasted. That way of doing things stuck to the station like the oil on the floor mats. Folks came back because Dad fixed things right, because he told them plainly if something needed replacing, because he treated people like people rather than like a sale. The town was tired but not dead. Folks wanted honest jobs that didn't leave when the tax credits dried up. They wanted steady paychecks and the kind of pride that showed up in the way someone waved from a truck and meant it. Losing the station would have been more than a closed sign. It'd be a hollow corner where neighbors stopped meeting and where the small things that held us together went missing. I get that in the way the bus driver always waves and the librarian asks me about the morning's weather. That's the baseline, small, stubborn, and not for sale just because someone with a nicer pen says it is. The pressure came like a fly you notice only after it's on your neck. At first it was a text that read like concern. "Just checking in, Nora, how are things?" Sent at 9 in the morning from my brother Tyler. Then Aunt Linda left a voicemail that sounded like a hug until the end when she said, "The family's appearance matters." The spreadsheet Scott emailed looked polite until I scrolled and saw numbers stacked like a ladder leaning out the window. "Sell before the repairs pile up," they all said in different tones, but the message was the same: let someone else carry the mess. They didn't say it harshly. They used friendly words that felt soft until you pressed them and found the point. There was an art to it. Call without asking for anything, send a glossy offer with a friendly deadline, remind me of taxes like a casual fact. My phone buzzed with polite nudges. Reminders about market timing, suggested appraisers, offers that expire soon like a coupon. Aunt Linda's voicemails folded into each other, tidy and unnerving, suggesting I should join the family plan for security. Tyler's texts came with photos of a house with a sold sign out front, as if showing me what could be mine in a different life. Scott's messages were sentence perfect, the kind that sound like they're built not to be argued with. Each note felt like a slow push. I stacked them on my desk like a small tower and kept working. I clamped down the instinct to answer quickly and let them see me pause. If they wanted me to move fast, I decided I'd move deliberately. Then one afternoon they came together. They walked in with smiles that belonged on brochures. Tyler had on a jacket that didn't have grease on the sleeve. Scott smelled like a conference room. They talked about being helpful and used the same friendly tones that had been softening me in texts. They handed me a printed offer bound in a neat folder. The numbers were round and shiny in a way that made people in suits smile. "No headaches," Tyler said, tapping the paper like it was blank. "Quick close," Scott added in that even, gentle way he had perfected. Their developer friend lingered outside in a car with a clean interior and watched me through the service bay window, pretending to check messages. He smiled at them like they shared a joke. They tried to make it sound like a rescue. "We just want to protect you from the business side," they said, as if the months I'd spent balancing invoices and buying parts didn't count. They called the station a money pit in the kind of voice people use when they're trying to be clinical and end up sounding cruel. They pressed the idea of revitalization, new facades, new signs like it was the only way to move forward. I asked for time and they acted like that was generous. They put a soft deadline on the folder and said, "Offers like this don't stay open forever." I watched their faces change when I said I needed a few days. The patient smiles slipped into a steadier pressure. The developer's eyes wandered once more to the back lot like a man checking where to plant a flag. That night, long after they left with their folder and that too easy air, I pulled Dad's ledger to make a list of what actually needed fixing. The ledger was a rough thing, coffee stains, dog-eared edges, his handwriting like small machinery. I flipped pages until a dot of red pencil caught my eye. There it was, a chain of tiny, deliberate dots down the margin. I ran my thumb over them and felt the catch in the paper where his red pencil had dug in a little. Besides some of the dates, he'd written short notes, plain words, not the legal kind, like backlot, parcel 7, hold, and sometimes just an arrow. The red marks lined up into a path across the pages, and they matched a folded map tucked into the back of the ledger. I spread his maps on the bench under the fluorescent light and traced the red dots with my finger. My fingertip left a small smudge where the paper had been handled so many times. The maps were hand-drawn, not fancy lines and names scratched in ink, corners folded soft. There were little notes in his blocky hand, too. "Neighbor cell okay, payment set, don't rush." He had circled one date 3 times and underlined the word steady like it might be a person. The pattern of dots made a ring around the station, almost like he had been making sure something stayed under his watch. My mouth went dry with a wild, sudden idea that the land under and around the station might be more than dirt. The ledger had no big promises, just small, regular entries that added up to care. I felt Dad's hand in those pages, slow, patient, not showy. He had been doing something in the quiet, and whatever it wasn't for a headline. At dawn, I walked the back lot with a flashlight and the maps folded in my back pocket. The air smelled different there, cleaner, sharp, like metal and damp earth. Dew made my boots hiss on the gravel. The weeds had been taller than I remembered, a green that scraped at my jeans. I moved slow because the place felt like a thing waking up, not just a patch of ground. Behind a stack of pallets and a broken wooden spool stood a rusted frame that looked like the skeleton of something that once reached for air. It leaned like an old signpost tired of standing. A narrow gate had a chain around it, and the padlock had a tiny smear of red paint across its clasp. I stopped and touched the smear with the pad of my thumb, and for a second I tasted the iron tang of rust in the air. I climbed the short fence, careful not to tear my gloves, and crouched by the base of the frame. There was a capped pipe, stubbed off and old, with a faded label that warned in small, sun-bleached letters. The soil around it had a faint mineral smell that made my scalp prick. I knelt and brushed aside leaves and found where someone had tamped the dirt down in years past, a patch of ground different from the rest. The metal there was cooler than the dawn. I took photos with my phone, hands that trembled a little more than I liked, and marked the coordinates in a notebook like Dad might have done, short, clear notes. I whispered, "Dad, what did you do?" into the quiet, like saying his name might wake the map into telling me the truth. Standing there, smelling rust and new spring grass and the engine oil still tucked in my gloves, I felt the weight of whatever Dad had been keeping settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just old junk rusting under weeds. It was a discovery that made knives in the dark look a lot less imaginary. I stuffed the maps back in my pocket and walked out with my boots leaving prints in the damp ground, a small, stubborn proof that the station held more than a pump and a promise. My hands shook when I opened the letter. He'd written to me in a voice that sounds like the man I leaned on a million times, simple, plain, and a little stubborn. "If you're reading this, they've come knocking," he'd written. "The land isn't gold unless it feeds the town. Don't sell the steering wheel." He explained in short, clear sentences that he'd bought rights under several nearby parcels over the years, small payments, quiet conversations with neighbors who trusted him, and that he'd always meant for whatever was under the ground to help the people who lived here. He drew little arrows on one of the maps, showed test spots, and wrote names like neighbors do when they're reminding you of who to call. Under one date, he'd scrawled, "Hold steady. No fast money." He mentioned a padlock with a telltale red smudge and a locker at the county records office that the keys would open. The maps weren't fancy, they were hand-sketched and practical. Boundaries, names, and notations like "watch this line" and "stay in touch" dotted the paper. Nothing legal sounding, no fancy language, just the sort of plain talk Dad used when he wanted someone to understand without the noise. I felt like I was reading instructions he'd written for a future where the town still mattered. He'd left me a small, stubborn plan: take care of what's under our feet and use it to keep the place that raised us alive. The last line was written big enough that even his poor handwriting tried to be emphatic. "Don't let them take the wheel." I walked into the county building carrying the maps folded tight like a secret. The fluorescent lights there are too bright and make everyone look like they're under a microscope, but Ray Collins looked the same, sleeves rolled up, a salt and pepper beard, and that soft, steady way of listening. He remembered Dad right away and said he liked to do things without noise. He set the papers on his desk, and that desk, organized, practical, a map of county stamps, suddenly felt like a courtroom of common sense. Ray read the letter slow, held the keys up to the light, and then took a walk with me out to the back lot the next morning. He didn't promise miracles. He told me what I needed and what I should watch out for. The pipe I'd found could be real, the maps looked like they matched county lines, and the pattern Dad left could be meaningful. But he said it plain: value draws vultures, Nora. Folks who want quick money don't care about how the town stands afterward. He showed me a cheap trick: take photographs with timestamps, leave copies of everything in a safe place off-site, and don't sign anything without a room full of people who know what's at stake. He offered to walk the site after hours with me and to check the county records quietly, not because he had to, but because he owed Dad that much. He also gave me a few practical steps I'd never thought about. Mark the maps with permanent ink so no one can dispute the lines, note who signed what and when, and make sure every call or meeting is logged. His voice was low and steady when he said, "They'll try to make you hurry. Slow is your tool." After Ray left, I went home and sat with Dad's letter on my kitchen table. My brothers came back 2 days later as if the station had become public property overnight. They wore suits like uniforms and smiles like practiced things. Tyler carried a leather folder and Scott had a polite look that meant he'd do anything to get to the result he wanted. They spoke like people reading from the same script. "We're trying to protect you. It's a lot to take on. We've got an offer that'll make life easy." They wanted me to sign, to sell, to let someone with a nicer pen take the worry. I could have told them I'd found maps and keys and a letter and a rusting frame in the back lot, but they'd have told me to let the experts decide. I decided to use a different trick: play small, act slow. I practiced the pause. When Tyler slid the folder across the counter, I didn't snatch it. I acted like a woman who needed time to breathe, to grieve, to remember what Dad's voice sounded like before the world pressed in. "Give me a week," I said, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to the woman Dad knew, steady, not loud. They smiled like teachers who'd just been given a participation badge. "A week is generous," Tyler said, meaning it as a nudge. "We'll keep the offer on the table." Scott handed me a draft of terms like it was a hug. I put it in my file, made a copy, and tucked it away. Inside, I set a secret timer that had nothing to do with their little soft deadline. 7 days is enough time to make the town stand with you if you give them the truth. I'd make them underestimate me while I gathered every piece of evidence I could find. I walked the town like someone taking stock of what mattered. The diner smelled of bacon and coffee and oil, 3 steady things. The feed store had a line of boots on its floor and a man who could name every bolt on a tractor. I left a business card with a note at the library and walked to Marla Owen's office. She runs the paper like a person who stitches towns together with ink. Marla put the kettle on and made coffee the way she makes stories, strong and plainly sweet. I told her about Dad's letter without theatrics and told her I needed someone who would print things clearly without spin. She said, "Bring me the papers. I'll run the whole thing as a local story, not a spectacle." Her voice was the kind that makes you feel like the world still listens to the small truth. I wrote a petition on a legal pad in block letters. Local jobs first, safety checks posted, a scholarship in Dad's name. Simple things, no promises that look like fluff. I walked the petition to the bus driver who'd been stopping for tire pressure since before I was born, to the high school coach who'd pulled his truck into my bay last winter, and to the librarian who'd been dusting shelves since my first grade. I left a copy with the mayor's sister and with old Mrs. Dalton, who always remembered birthdays. Signatures came slower and truer than any sale would have. Folks asked questions and wanted answers, not promises. Marla put a small note on the front page about a town meeting I was planning, and it felt like calling a small bell. People heard it. But pressure has a way of turning soft words into a tightening. Aunt Linda invited me to family supper the night after I started the petition. Her house smelled like roast and lemon polish. Her living room had all the right things placed in the right places. She smiled and poured wine like she was spreading a net. She asked about my work in a way that sounded like interest and landed like instruction. "The boys are worried," she said, slipping into that voice that believes a problem can be fixed with a plan and a ledger. She told me Dad had been stubborn, that none of this was practical, and that maybe I should listen to reason before pride took me too far. She reminded me softly that family should be united. I asked her directly about the back lot and the land. For a moment her hand tightened on her wineglass like she'd been burned. She smiled too quickly and said, "I don't know much about that." Then she softened and told me the same thing my brothers had told me. "Sell, move on, don't make a scene." I watched for tiny tells, her fingers worrying the napkin, the way her eyes flicked to the hallway like she expected someone to come and confirm or deny what we were saying. When I left, she walked me to the door with a hand that felt like a bridle. "You should trust the boys," she said again, as if trust were a shape you could press onto someone and it would fit. She left me with a certainty that stung. The push to sell was coordinated and practiced, and I wasn't supposed to know why. But I also left with a kind of fuel. Aunt Linda's gentle pressure showed me the quiet way people try to close a room before you know the rules. It told me I had to keep the door open, keep the maps and keys safe, and make sure the town heard the plan before they heard the sale. I went home and locked Dad's ledger in the bottom drawer and slept with the maps under my pillow like a child guarding a small treasure. Timing was a fingerprint. The lot had been like that for years. We'd stacked pallets the same way for as long as I could remember. Someone had decided suddenly that the same scrap was a hazard and turned it into official paper. I rented a dumpster because there's no dramatic way to clean a mess other than doing it. The hauling company smelled like diesel and lemon oil. I worked until my hands were raw, moving metal in the heat, hauling a coil of wire that snagged my glove and left a smear of rust across my palm. I didn't sleep much that week. I sorted pieces into piles, wiped a layer of oil from old parts, and patched the worst of the fences. The inspector came back and walked the lot with a clipboard, nodding now and then, and I watched him cross stuff off his list. He looked at me with a small, neutral sympathy and said the immediate problem was fixed. The cost wasn't just money. I lost hours I'd set aside for research. I spent my small cash on the dumpster and a roll-off fee that bit into the account I was counting on to pay for the compressor. I missed an afternoon at the school where Maddie was supposed to come by and help me array petition signatures, and I felt the weight of that absence. Mostly, the notice proved what I'd feared. Someone was warming up a plan to make the station seem unsafe so they could force a sale cheap. They were willing to choreograph a problem to make a problem real. That realization made me steady and frantic at the same time. I felt foolish for not locking everything tighter sooner, and I felt furious at how efficient intimidation can be when people don't check the box of human decency. Adjusting my plan was a practical thing. I didn't have lawyers on speed dial or a war chest of cash, but I had Dad's ledger, a steady habit of making lists, and people who still cared. First, I moved Dad's original maps and the letter out of the office and into a fireproof box I could bolt under the lift. I made high-quality copies and left them with Marla at the paper and with Ray at his office. Marla hid a copy in the newspaper's safe, which smelled like ink and old coffee and felt, to me, like a small bastion. Ray slipped his copy into a county records locker with a key he lent me for emergency access. I also started a simple digital backup, scanned the letters and photos, and emailed them to a private account with two-factor protection and a password I'd never used before. It felt like modern seatbelts. I bought a couple of cheap motion cameras, nothing fancy, just things that would record movement, and I hid one inside an old coffee can by the office door. I taped another facing the back lot and hooked them to my phone so I'd get an alert if something moved. I changed the locks on the office and got a sturdier side door. I also put a small notice on the front counter that said, plainly and calmly, "Community files available upon request." I wanted transparency and witnesses. I wanted people to know that if anyone tried to say the station was a hazard, there would be a track of actions showing otherwise. At the same time, I still pretended to be slow and faintly out of my depth with my brothers when they called. Let them think I was still dithering. Let them underestimate the speed at which I was moving. But when it came to the town, I stopped being coy. I set the date for the town meeting and put the word out the way folks here do: flyers, a call in to Marla, and a visit to the diner to talk to those who might not read the paper. I rehearsed my plain language points until they looked like sentences that anyone could repeat on a porch. That way, when I spoke, I wouldn't be the only one saying it. Then Bridgemont stepped in like a company that knows how doors open. They brought a suit into my life that actually smelled faintly of new leather and used perfume. This time my brothers came with the company's vice president, Karen Bolton, and Daniel Reed, their legal counsel, sitting behind her with a pad. He didn't look at much because he didn't need to. He had phrases ready. They sat in the office like people who'd planned to sit there. Karen was all calm, a practiced smile and a voice like a radio anchor. Daniel's suit made him look invisible in a room where other people were wearing grease and grief. Graham Pierce, the local developer, lingered in the lot as if checking which angle to sell the light from. They talked partnership with a warmth that meant watch your pockets. Karen asked me about community plans and jobs, and Daniel added in the right words about process and certainty. Tyler and Scott leaned into the conversation like they were proud puppies that were finally getting ready to work. They kept saying win-win, which is the phrase people use when they've already decided which side wins. Karen made polite noises about safety and oversight while Daniel passed a small stack of papers that looked official and safe. But when I asked simple human questions, who hires the crew, who sets the safety checks, who pays for local training, their answers frayed into smaller promises. They kept the big smiles but weren't specific about who would be accountable when something went wrong. They wanted a quick answer and they wanted me to sign. They left me offer by Friday like a ticking clock. The hazard label scheme surfaced in a way that wasn't cinematic but was unmistakable once I looked. I got an anonymous email from a county clerk who respected Dad. She'd forwarded a string of messages she'd happened upon, colleagues talking in a way that assumed no one was paying attention. One of the messages was from Graham to an associate, and it used a phrase that made my skin crawl. Stack the complaints. It was followed by a suggestion to push a couple of official inspections and to apply pressure to the little sister so the sale would look like the practical choice. The tone was casual. They treated people like chess pieces. The clerk's forwarding note read, "I don't want to be mixed up in this, Nora, but I thought you should see it." I printed the messages, highlighted names and dates, and put a big red "Received" on the corner with today's date. That night, a blocked number left a voice message, steady, male, and without much emotion. "Sell now or watch the county shut you down," he said. No threats of violence, just a professional calm that sounded like someone used to making other people's lives smaller. The voice was quiet, but my phone speaker made it sound loud and hungry. I saved the file twice, emailed it to myself, and put the written transcript in a folder. I didn't call back. I planned to let the town hear the file, not have me whisper about it in private. If they were going to scare me, they were going to do it where the light could find them. Then someone came at night. The coffee can camera in the office pinged me at 1:13 a.m. like a mosquito bite that wakes you. I was already half asleep when the phone buzzed. I threw on boots and took a tire iron, the closest thing to a flashlight in the dark, and moved as quietly as I could. The office light shivered on to a scene that smelled like old oil and colder metal. A man in a dark jacket was rifling through a drawer, cursing under his breath when he didn't find much. He had gloves on, but one sleeve rode up and left a smear of black grease on his wrist when he grabbed the wrong box. He moved like someone who'd done this before, efficient, quick. When the side door slammed open behind him, I slammed a hand on my radio to call the sheriff and yelled, "Hey!" He looked up, and for a second I saw the corner of his jaw and the cut of his jacket. He bolted and clipped the frame on his way out, dragging his hand across the door and smearing a streak of oil on the jamb. I saw the flash of a company jacket under a streetlight as he ran to the car. My heart was banging in my ears like a hammer, my breath came short and sharp. I called 911 and Sheriff Cole Bennett answered like he usually does, straight and no nonsense. He showed up with a flashlight and the careful patience of a man who's seen too many midnight calls. He took photographs, noted the time, and asked for the footage. The recording had shadows, but the shape and the jacket matched things I'd seen in the developer's car the other day. The grease smear on the frame matched the grease smear on one of the company vans parked near the lot a few mornings earlier, the kind of small detail only someone living in a place like this notices and keeps in mind. Sheriff Bennett made a report and told me to drop off the files at the station. He said he'd run the prints and follow up. He wasn't loudly confident, but there was a steady promise in how he wrote the report, a promise that this would live on paper now and not only in the quiet of my mind. I sat on the back steps after he left and listened to the still air and the tiny noises that mark the night, a fan clicking, a distant dog barking, the gravel settling. I felt boxed in and open at the same time. The fight had become physical. The people who wanted the land were willing to break into a locked office at night. They were willing to make worry feel official. I went inside, locked the office, and sat at Dad's desk with the letter open on my knee. The keys clinked like small, honest music in my hand. I saved the footage in 3 places and put the files in a lockbox that I'd duct-taped to the underside of the workbench. I texted Marla the moment the sheriff left and asked her to be ready to post the story if anything more happened. I called Ray and told him the news in a voice that was thinner than I wanted. He said he'd be over before breakfast. I lay down for an hour with the radio low and the maps under my arm like a shield. Whatever came next, I thought we'd be ready to name it for what it was. She sat on the grease-stained stool watching me work and asked small, perfect questions about a carburetor like a lifeline. I knelt down and showed her how to read a dipstick, how the oil tells you a story if you know how to listen. She wanted to know if my fight was worth it. "Are you hurting the town?" she asked, and the way she said it made me take the breath out of my chest. I told her the truth as plainly as I know how. We're trying to keep jobs here and we'll do it with rules that make sense. I promised her a scholarship in Grandpa's dad's name for trade and engineering training so kids who loved their hands like she did would have a way forward. Her dad, meanwhile, saw only headlines, his wife's name in a paper he didn't read, and he clamped down. He grounded her from station visits and from coming to help with petitions. I could feel the teeth in the family tug-of-war through an open door, but Maddie was sly in the small ways kids can be. She slipped me a note folded twice and tucked into the panel of a toolbox while I was under a truck. It said, "I'll help count signatures," with a doodle of a wrench and a heart. She wanted to be part of it in the only way she could, by showing up where she could and learning how things are mended. I decided hard things for her. I kept her out of the front row at the public meetings and had her sit with the librarian where the noise wouldn't hit her like a fist. I taught her how to take neat notes and to listen without answering unless she was asked. That felt like armor. Teach her how to stand in a crowd without getting knocked over. It hurt when her dad scolded her, and harder because I could see how torn she was. But every night she'd text me little updates, an engine note, a sketch, a question about a part, and I'd answer. I made room for her curiosity and for her grief. She's learning patience the hard way, and the fight is a lesson I don't want to steal from her by making it ugly. Building the public case became my main work because secrecy was exactly what they'd been counting on. If I let them make the sale in private, I'd never hear the town's voice anyway. I asked Marla to run an honest piece about Dad and the station. She came by with a notepad and a thermos of coffee and listened to Dad's plain words in the letter as if she was plucking stitches from a sweater. She promised a front-page story that would tell what Dad had done in small, clear language, no industry talk, nothing that would make people's eyes glaze. She wanted the facts and people's names, not drama. Ray helped me shape the safety promises into things anyone could check. He's a county engineer, but he hates official speak, so he gave me language I could post on a wall. Daily air checks, weekly water readings, alarms that actually go off when they should, and training paid for by the operation. He sketched a checklist on a legal pad that looked like a grocery list. Test here, log there, call this number if you see that. We made big, readable maps with colored dots that showed where the tests would be done and how the money would be split toward the scholarship. Marla printed them in the paper and put a photo of Dad's red pencil on the front page, and people read it the way they read weather, because it's about what affects their day. I drafted a petition that didn't use fancy words. It said, "Keep jobs local, require posted safety checks, and start a scholarship in Dad's name." People signed it because it was about things that mattered in their pockets and their kids' futures. Signatures came from folks I expected and from people I didn't: bus drivers, a nurse at the clinic, a high school teacher who'd been smelling oil in the afternoons and remembered Dad fixing her brother's truck. We set a town meeting with a simple title, Our Ground, Our Say. I invited the company, the developer, my brothers, the sheriff, and every neighbor. Nothing would happen behind closed doors. I set up displays on the station counter with copies of Dad's letter, the maps, and the red pencil ledger pulled from his desk. I taped a clear sheet on the wall that showed the safety checklist in plain words and put a sign-up sheet for anyone who wanted to volunteer to help watch the numbers and the hiring. I mailed a simple note to the company's office and left a flyer in Graham Pierce's mailbox. If they wanted to come and make their pitch, they'd do it in front of people whose houses might be affected. transparency would be my shield. Losing a resource felt like a small, practical wound that changed how I moved. Ray called me one afternoon and his voice had a soft edge I hadn't heard before. He'd been asked, quietly, to step back from advising me in his official capacity because it might look like the county was taking sides. He didn't want to argue. He said he'd still be there as a neighbor and friend in the crowd if he had to be, but not with the county stamp beside his name. He slid the legal-sounding language away and made it plain. I'll be there as Ray, not the county. I can't stand beside you with my hat on both heads. I felt the loss like a sudden draft, one less official voice to point to when the company tried to say everything was above board. The county clerk who'd forwarded me the messages was alarmed and asked me not to use her name. She'd done me a favor by passing along the email thread, and she was scared about being tied to anything that looked politically messy. I promised her privacy and felt the strain of losing quiet helpers who feared their jobs. Places like this are a net of favors and small trusts. When one thread is yanked out, others fray. I had to adjust and make the circle bigger, more people in daylight, fewer whispers behind closed doors. That's when I decided to burn the comfortable bridge my brothers were offering. They came to me privately with a version of peace dressed up as charity, a bonus check if I'd sign now, a plaque with Dad's name if I'd stop asking questions, and a non-binding promise to honor the town. It was the kind of offer people make when they want a quicker exit. Tyler's smile was glossy and practiced. Scott's voice was even and smooth. They said they were protecting me, but their eyes moved like men counting the price of a table. I told them no, and I told them cleanly. I put the ledger on the counter and said, I keep the steering wheel, we do this clean, or I do it without you. My words landed like a tool set slammed on the bench. Tyler's face went hard, then smaller. Scott's jaw tightened in that way it does when he's thinking of legal recourse. You don't understand the hassle, Tyler said, which is how men tell you they believe a thing about you without asking if it's true. Scott mentioned process like a warning. Aunt Linda called right after they left and I didn't answer. I texted her the meeting date and wrote, you should hear everything. That was my line in the sand. No more family-only talks, no whispered deals. From now on, whatever they wanted would be said in a room full of witnesses. Burning that bridge felt like setting a pot to boil under a lid. It also freed me. Without secret offers on the table, I could hold the narrative in public. I posted flyers with the date, time, and agenda: station future, community jobs, safety plan, Jack Hale scholarship. I tacked one to the company rep's office door. I left one in the developer's mail slot without comment. I called the town clerk to reserve the hall, and she laughed like someone who'd been waiting for a fight to be put in daylight. Good luck, kiddo, she said, and I heard the warmth in it that only people from small towns can give. I told the sheriff about the meeting and he agreed to be there, steady and plain. I dropped a note at Marla's desk that simply said, "We're doing this live." She put it on her board and nodded like a woman who understood how to pull a town together and how to make newspaper pages matter. I delivered a handful of flyers to the people who don't trust paper: bus drivers, the school janitor, the woman who works the morning shift at the factory. I put a stack in the diner and asked the owner to keep a few at the register. The posters were simple: no legal speak, time, place, why. With the date public, there was no quietly closed door for them to slip through. If I blinked now, I'd lose the chance to make the town's voice louder than the company's polished brochure. I hung the last flyer on the station bulletin board and felt a small, fierce calm settle in my chest like oil going into an engine. We checked the sequence until the coffee went cold. Ray wanted the safety checklist to be the first takeaway after the human pieces. The things people could do and see: daily air checks posted on a board, weekly water readings, alarms that make real noise, and a training schedule for hires. He mocked up a simple chart in big type so anyone could read it without squinting. Marla wanted the photos and the red pencil on the front page because people know what a handwritten mark looks like. It means someone cared enough to mark it. I practiced opening with Dad's letter in my hand and saying exactly what he'd told me, don't let them take the wheel, and not letting my voice wobble on the words. Ray coached me on pauses. Say a line, then wait. Let the words hang in the room. Silence does more work than explanation sometimes. We packed extra folders for everyone: company reps, the developer, the sheriff, the town board, and a stack for the press. Each folder had a copy of the maps, the ledger page with red dots, the scanned memo of the email thread that had been forwarded to me, and a printed transcript of the voicemail. Marla insisted we keep everything in plain English at the top of each packet. What this means for you. She wanted no one in the audience to feel like they were listening to a foreign language. Ray said the same thing from the other side of the table: plain words, plain numbers. He rechecked the timing for when I'd play the voicemail so the room would be quiet and the sound would be undeniable. We rehearsed the flow twice in the dining room, with Marla acting as the audience and Ray as a kind of friendly skeptic who'd ask the hard questions we knew would come. He asked, "Why you?" And I had the exact answer: because it's my name on the papers, because Dad trusted me, because I know the people here. He asked, "Why now?" And I said, because if I wait, someone else will make the choice for us behind closed doors. Marla told me to look people in the eye when I said those things so they'd hear a person, not a speech. We practiced the trap, the line where I'd hold up the emails and say, "These are not conjecture," then press play on the voicemail and let the room listen. We timed the pause after the message so no one would rush in to explain away what they'd just heard. It felt like laying a snare, but a clean one, not a trick to humiliate, just a way to let the truth land in daylight. Securing the land and files felt like locking down a small, fragile kite before a windstorm. I changed the locks on the office and had a locksmith, old Tony from down the street, install a heavier deadbolt. Tony grinned at me like he'd seen right through my determination and handed me the new key with a caution. "Don't lose this." I kept one key on Dad's ring and put the rest in a safe deposit box 2 towns over. I rented a cheap lockbox and bolted Dad's originals to the underside of a heavy workbench, and then I took copies to 3 different places. Marla's office safe, Ray's county locker, and a small safe deposit at the bank. I even emailed scanned copies to a private account with a 2-step password that only I knew. We put motion detectors in the office and the back lot, cheap ones that ping my phone and raise if anything moves at night. I hid a camera in an old coffee can by the office door and planted another on the back lot facing the rusted frame. The cameras were crude, but they recorded the truth. I set my phone to take images every hour so we'd have a time-stamped trail of what the lot looked like day in and day out. I asked Sheriff Cole Bennett to drive by most nights and to keep an eye out. He nodded and said, in the way he does, "That's all business. I'll look in when I can." It wasn't a promise of a stakeout, but it was someone saying we'd be watched now, and not only by me. Before the meeting, I did the one thing that steadied me more than anything else. I went to Dad's grave. The stone is cool under my palm and the grass smelled like cut hay that afternoon. I read the letter again out loud to him, the one he'd left folded into that false back, and I told him what I planned to say. I left his red pencil on the stone for a moment, then slid it back into my breast pocket like a charm. I thought about Maddie, that little knot of determination with a notebook and a wrench doodle, and I thought about what I wanted her to learn from me. I wanted her to learn that you can stand up without becoming someone who hurts people for the sake of winning. I wanted to prove you could be stubborn and kind in the same breath. My personal stakes felt huge in a way that had nothing to do with money. I wasn't just protecting a building. I was protecting the name on the door and the memory of a man who took careful steps to do right. I could imagine the station sold, its pumps replaced with some slick logo, my neighbors shuffled like cards into contracts that hadn't been read. I could imagine Maddie told to be proud of a photo op rather than the work that made a living. I wanted better for her. I wanted better for all of us. So I told myself I'd rather fail in daylight than win with a hidden ledger and a plaque that said someone else did the work. I slept badly the night before the meeting, but when I woke I felt a small kind of calm, like an engine warming up. something steady, practical, and ready. The town hall the night of the meeting smelled of floor wax and coffee, a combination that makes any room feel like it could hold both arguments and funerals. Folding chairs were set in rows and people arrived early like they do when they mean to listen. The company reps came with the kind of confidence that looks practiced: Karen Bolton in a sharp jacket that caught the light, Daniel Reed with a neat legal pad, and Graham Pierce with his developer posture. Tyler hovered near the mic with an expression that moved between eager and rehearsed. Scott was more contained, papers tucked under his arm like a shield. Ray sat in the third row with his arms folded, and Marla set her phone to record on the front table with the steady professionalism I trust. I stepped up to the mic with Dad's letter in my hand and felt the weight of it like a steady thing. The lights overhead hummed and a few children shuffled in the back. The sheriff stood by the exit in case things got loud, and the mayor's sister sat with a pen, ready to sign in volunteers. People I knew: Mrs. Dalton, who always brought pies for community events, the bus driver who'd been getting his tires fixed at dawn for years, filled half the room. The company's team spread papers and smiled politely. When I tapped the mic, the sound rattled off the walls like the start of something that had been building. I said my name, my age, and the name on the station. I told the room I'd been given a letter from my dad and that I intended to read it. My voice steadied like tools in your hand when you know which to pick. The room leaned in. I described the safety rules without fancy terms: daily air checks posted where anyone can see them, weekly tests of nearby water, alarms that actually make noise and get listened to, and third-party checks that weren't just promises. I said the results would be posted on a board at the station and published in plain language in the paper. If something spickied, it would be there for everyone to read. I talked about the Jack Hale Scholarship as a fixed piece of the revenue, money that went to local trade schools and engineering programs so kids who liked their hands could learn a trade without leaving town. I said I wanted open books on safety and hiring, but private payrolls for people's privacy, transparency where it mattered, dignity where it didn't. Then I pointed to Karen Bolton and asked her to sign if Bridgemont would do all that in front of us. I asked the developer and my brothers to say whether they'd agree to these conditions now in public. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was quiet as a shop right before it opens, just waiting for the key to turn. For the reveal, I put the packet in the middle of the table and passed out copies: the ledger page with Dad's red dots, the scans of the maps, the email thread that had been forwarded to me, and a printout of the voicemail. I read the email aloud, slow and clear, the one where a developer talked about stacking complaints and making a place look troubled so a sale would feel like the only sensible thing. The words tasted bitter in my mouth when I said them out loud because those were the same words I'd felt in the pit of my stomach the week before. Then I hit play on my phone. The little recorder clicked and a male voice, calm and flat, said, "Sell now or watch the county shut you down." The sound filled the room like someone had opened a window in a closed car. I watched faces the way you watch gauges on a dashboard. One by one, their readings changed. Marla's pencil stilled, Ray's shoulders tightened, the developer's smile thinned. The vice president's hand went to her mouth. Karen looked like a woman hearing something she'd hoped wasn't true. Daniel Reed, the counsel, tried the practiced line, "We have no record of," and stopped because the email and the voicemail were both on print and on my phone. I held up the before and after photos of the back lot, the one shot 2 days before the inspection and the one after we cleaned it, and the inspector's notice with the exact date. I laid them side by side so you could see the timeline like a ruler. The librarian in the front row said under her breath, "So they made trouble and expected us to take the bill." The murmur rose like a tide moving in the room. Karen looked at her counsel like she'd been pitched into a storm she hadn't expected. Her first words were the polished ones companies use when they're still buying time. "We don't operate like that," but there was a tremor. She started scanning the packets I'd handed out, then looked up at the crowd and said, "If these allegations are true, we do not condone those tactics." Her voice was smaller than I'd expected. She glanced at Daniel and I saw him go pale enough that the office light made his face look like paper. Then the flip happened, the slow kind where a person turns and you see reason catch. Karen stood and she went to the microphone. "We will accept these conditions," she said, and the words felt like a cold wind that cleared smoke from a room. She said Bridgemont would sign in public if I took the lead, that they would accept the safety terms, the posted checks, and the scholarship arrangement. Daniel added that they would draft the simple documents tonight and bring them by the station. He looked tired and a little smaller for someone with a stack of papers he could wave like a shield. The developer shifted toward the exit and his smile fell into a line. "I offered my brothers a place at the table but not the wheel. Non-voting roles, clear job descriptions, no authority to push shortcuts or to cut corners on safety. Earn your place with work and a record," I told them. Tyler's face moved through a few shades of disbelief and irritation, while Scott opened his mouth like he might say paperwork would block this, then closed it. There was a long, small sound in the room. Someone clapped, and then another and another. Maddie clapped, quietly, with the librarian next to her smiling like she just watched a small miracle. After the applause, the room had a kind of settling that felt like a pause in a long story. People were still talking in low voices, parsing what had just happened. My brothers looked like men who had been used to walking into rooms and finding the keys already turned. The developer walked out with a tight jaw, the vice president stayed, and Daniel stayed too, but without his old air of certainty. The sheriff moved a little closer to the table like someone checking his options. I felt the heat of victory without joy. Victory is often dusty and practical, not the fireworks you see in movies. The immediate blowback arrived the way small, mean things do, sudden and noisy. Tyler went to a microphone and called me ingrate in a voice that tried to sound wounded and reasonable at once. Half the room hissed, half the room booed. The sheriff asked for calm. Scott muttered about process and the paperwork we'd signed into public view and about how rushed things were going to be. Aunt Linda started sobbing in the aisle and told anyone who'd listen that I'd broken the family. Her tears were wet and theatrical in a way that made people uncomfortable. Online, the developer spun a message that called the meeting a misunderstanding and suggested the town had been manipulated. His post was glossy and short and meant to be shared. The comments showed a split that felt like a mirror of the room, supporters of the station on one side and critics who loved the idea of progress on the other. Someone posted a picture of the meeting with my name and a snide caption. It stung even if the likes didn't matter. I didn't answer online. I liked the town's voice better than a stranger's keyboard. At the end of it, the company's public relations put out a bland statement about resolving issues through dialogue. It was careful, the kind of sentence that tries to hold both sides without committing to truth. Marla texted me, "Ignore the noise, you did good." Sheriff Bennett came up to me with the kind of expression that means business. He told me he'd file the physical evidence with the report and that the videos and emails made the case for an investigation. He didn't promise arrests, but he promised records, and records are the kind of thing that stay wet on paper long enough for a town to make sense of them. I didn't gloat. I thanked the company for agreeing to terms, and I thanked everyone who showed up. I walked the room and shook hands, handed out extra sign-in sheets for folks who wanted to be on the safety committee, and told volunteers where to meet on Monday. I wanted ordinary things to happen next: paperwork, schedules, names on paychecks. The developer's exit left behind a kind of stunned silence in the doorway where his ego had been. My brothers stood in the back, shoulders tight, and I met their eyes without flinching. One of them looked away, the other kept watching like a man who'd been surprised into humility. When the crowd thinned and folding chairs clicked in a slow, tired rhythm, I gathered the folders and the recorder. Marla stayed to talk logistics and to plan a follow-up story. Ray sat and took a breath as if he'd been holding it since this whole thing began. Maddie hugged my leg in the back, her notes tucked into her pocket, eyes bright and a little wild. The winds tasted of dust and coffee, not candy. I felt the shape of what I'd done. I'd turned private pressure into public fact, and in doing that, I'd moved the power from whispers into light. The cost would come small and steady, but the room had seen the truth, and a town's site is a kind of law of its own. I didn't get the county's note as an order so much as a promise. The town would have to be part of the cleaning up and the building up. The conditions meant the company had to be accountable in front of neighbors, not behind closed doors. Bridgemont agreed to the terms publicly that night, but a written county requirement made their promise stickier. They couldn't spin away from something on paper as easily as they might from a speech. The sheriff liked that part. He said a written, public trail makes it easier to follow the story if something gets messy again. Ray's recusal was official and awkward. He'd told the county he couldn't be the one with a county title and also be the front man next to me. That made some people nervous because he was the biggest hammer on our side, but he kept his promise in every other way. He showed up the first week as a private man with a cup of coffee and a hard hat, and his voice in the town hall sounded the same as it did in his office. Calm and clear, the county clerk who'd forwarded the email thread asked to stay anonymous, and I honored that. Losing official voices meant we had to make the town's voices louder. The new constraints pushed me to do practical, visible things fast. Ray drafted a simple public calendar that we posted on the station window, weekly air checks, water tests every Monday, and monthly third-party audits that anyone could attend. We set up a small community oversight board with people I trusted. Marla from the paper, the school shop teacher, the bus driver, a nurse from the clinic, and a farmer who knows dirt the way a surgeon knows skin. They'd meet every other week and had the right to ask questions and to see the logs. I liked that the board was made of neighbors who'd be affected by the work. Their questions would be hard in ways that mattered. Stabilizing the operation felt like tightening bolts to keep a machine from rattling itself to pieces. I hired a small crew of local people, 2 mechanics who knew old engines and loved them, a safety lead who kept things orderly, and a clerk who could make a spreadsheet that looked neat even to me. One of the hires was a guy named Javier who'd worked on combines and could read a machine like a book. He showed up with a thermos and a smile and asked where the coffee was. I handed him the rusted mug Dad kept at the bench and told him to make himself at home. Hiring locals didn't just mean jobs, it meant the work would have community fingerprints on it. We upgraded cameras and lights not for show but for records. The office had a new motion sensor and a camera with a wide lens. The back lot had 2 now, pointing at the rusted frame and the padlocked gate. I put a whiteboard in the office window where the daily readings would be posted in big black marker. Ray showed me how to format the logs so anyone could read them without squinting. Date, test, number, and a simple line that said normal or needs attention. I opened a small account at the local bank for the scholarship fund and posted the opening balance on the wall like a promise you could touch. We set up weekly office hours where anyone could stop by and ask me anything. People came with small things at first: questions about hiring, a worry about extra traffic, a note about a neighbor who wanted to work, and those small things turned into a rhythm. I met the company team on the back lot and walked every inch with them using checklists that had been written in plain words. That meeting felt like telling someone how to use a tool. If they cut corners, the town would see it on the whiteboard the next morning. Cleaning the mess was practical, unromantic work and necessary. Sheriff Bennett followed up on the break-in with a slow, patient investigation. He took prints, logged the grease smear photos, and filed my footage with the report. The sheriff told me little details, how the smear matched a pattern seen on a few vehicles, and that meant the break-in left a trail that could be followed. We replaced the side door that had been mangled, put a new frame in the threshold, and painted the jamb where the grease had slicked at the edge. Tony from hardware helped me pick a door that would resist a pry and smiled like a man who's glad to be useful. Bridgemont sent a crew to install air monitors so the readings could be independent and reliable. I learned how to read the output numbers that meant something when they were steady. The company showed me how the device worked, and I asked them to show me everything twice. We posted the first readings on the whiteboard the day they installed the monitor. nice, quiet numbers that made the bus driver come in and nod. The company also hired an independent lab to run weekly tests on our water, and the results came back with clear, plain stamps. If anything moved off normal, we'd post it and pause work until it was fixed. That pledge gave people the right to breathe easier. We also cleaned the back lot so there was no working ground for the hazard story. The dumpster came again for loose metal. We sorted parts into labeled bins and stacked them neat. The frame was scrubbed so the rust flakes didn't fall into puddles. I kept the grease smear photo in a folder labeled evidence and taped it to the inside of the file cabinet. People started dropping off resumes. One woman brought a stack of them with a care so gentle I felt like she was handing me something tender. Resumes are small signs of trust in this town. They're folded pages with names on them that means somebody hopes. Secondary conflicts arrived like small tremors after an earthquake, unexpected and intrusive. Maddie's relationship with her dad stayed frayed for a while. Tyler wanted the image of a smiling daughter for the brochures he'd imagined, and he didn't understand why she wanted to learn torque instead of lipstick. He tightened the leash because he thought he was protecting her image, not realizing protection could look different to her. She texted me little updates about parts and notes and sometimes just a wrench doodle. I kept her out of headlines and tucked her into the librarian's seat during big meetings. Aunt Linda surprised me when she came by with a paper bag of cookies and a face that looked washed out. She sat at the counter, and when she could hold steady, she admitted something I'd suspected but hadn't heard from her mouth. Years ago, she urged Dad to sell, that she'd been pushing him toward the practical choice, and for that she said she'd been cut out of some decisions. Her voice broke when she said it, and she asked for my forgiveness like she was asking for permission to live in the family again. I didn't make a speech. I took a cookie and said I'd rather have her at my table than an empty seat. Her apology didn't fix everything, but it changed the shape of dinner invitations. My brothers kept being difficult in different ways. Tyler refused the non-voting role I offered. He said, loudly and with the kind of pride that keeps a mouth shut, that he couldn't accept being sidelined. Scott signed on in paper, but in practice he dragged his feet with paperwork and timelines and process that slowed things. He'd show up at a meeting and then find a reason to be elsewhere. It didn't surprise me. People who have spent years avoiding grease don't like getting it under their nails. The developer tried to reframe the story online, dropping hints that I'd sold out after construction started. Marla called me at midnight once, angry and steady, and published a clean correction showing my signed statement about leading the operation. The cleaner the town's records were, the less useful the developer's rumor mill became. There were debates at council meetings about traffic and noise and who would be hired. I chaired 2 open sessions where people could come, raise their concerns, and watch the company answer in plain words. Sometimes the company's answers felt rehearsed, but being asked the same questions by a bus driver, a nurse, and a teacher in the same room made the rehearsed answers have to mean something real. We adjusted shifts to keep morning traffic light and committed to a truck path that avoided school drop-off times. Those small concessions made neighbors breathe easier. Preparing for the next inevitable wave of uncertainty became routine. We wrote a simple training plan that started with safety basics and moved into tools and procedures. Everyone signed in at orientation so we'd have a record of who knew what and when. We ran mock drills where someone would pretend a monitor spiked and we'd practice pausing work and notifying people. Those drills felt clumsy at first, people stumbled through the scripts, but every trial made the reactions smoother. The training list was posted in the shop in plain handwriting: safety first, tools second, talk to someone if you don't know. I drafted a plain language guide titled How We Keep You Safe and stapled copies to the board outside the office. It read like a friendly neighbor: who to call, what numbers mean, how often tests happen, and what would happen if something went wrong. I asked the company to assign a community liaison who actually lived nearby, someone who could walk the street and hear the small worries we all have. They brought a woman named Ellie who grew up in the next town and spoke like she knew our rhythms. She started going to the coffee shop and listening, and people liked that. You can tell when someone is listening differently than when someone is selling. We set the scholarship committee for the Jack Hale Fund with the school counselor, Marla, and the shop teacher. They picked criteria that made sense. A student who loved hands-on work, a clear plan for training, and a promise that the money wouldn't just be a line on a spreadsheet. We scheduled the next oversight meeting for 2 weeks out and asked the company to bring a written step-by-step timeline for any major work. Each small plan made the whole thing less likely to be blindsided. I knew the old guard might try one last swing, some last rumor, some small sabotage, but the more we built in daylight, the test results, the whiteboard logs, the community board, the less room they had to hide. Preparing for uncertainty wasn't about being paranoid, it was about making a habit of candor. In a town like ours, honesty becomes a kind of weather system. Once people see it every day, they begin to rely on it. And if someone tried to stomp that pattern out, we'd have too many witnesses for a lie to take root. The sheriff checked the IDs, and as the day cooled, half the names on the developer's sheet didn't match local addresses. Word travels here by word of mouth and coffee, so folks wandered by, looked at the list, and shook their heads. The man with the clipboard got angrier and started calling people names. Tyler sent me a text asking me to take the money he'd laid out months ago, and for a minute I thought about walking over and signing away the argument. But I pictured the petitioned faces and the neat signatures that would mean other people had made a choice for us, and I set my phone down. That afternoon, the company called to say the offer still stood if I'd sign the formal papers by the end of the week. They wanted the schedule and the paperwork to be in place for their investors. It felt like someone handing you a stopwatch at a race you didn't know you were running. Sign now and lock the terms, they said. Delay and risk letting the other side find a new trick. I paced the office with my hands on the counter and breathed the smell of solvent and coffee. I thought about Dad's ledger and how he'd circled dates and written steady. I thought about Maddie and the way she'd looked at me the night before, her notebook open, a doodled wrench as if she was engraving a sentence in her memory. I set up a final open house instead of a private signing. If they wanted to pin me into a corner, I'd pin them into a room where people could see what they were signing. I laid everything out on the counter in plain folders. The maps, the ledger, the email thread, the voicemail, and a draft of the partnership with clear, simple points. I invited anyone who wanted to read and asked the company to send their counsel. They sent someone. The room filled up with neighbors, 2 county clerks who'd offered quiet help, and a woman from the local college who'd been following our story. I read Dad's letter again in front of them, and then, with my hand steady, I signed the partnership in the way we do small, important things. Not loudly, just with the honest motion of a pen. I signed because control meant something specific. It meant I could stop work if a reading spiked and not get called a troublemaker. It meant I could insist that hires be local and that training be paid. It meant the scholarship money would actually go to the school counselor's account and be spent on kids who wanted trade or engineering training. I handed my brothers non-voting roles, spelled out the tasks they could do, and put the power where it belonged. One of them took the paper in silence, face closed, the other tore his copy in half and walked out, the sound like a small, angry animal. I shook the company rep's hand and said, "If you cut corners, I shut you down." She said, "Deal," like someone who just accepted a checklist. When the papers were folded and filed, life didn't suddenly go soft. There were schedules and to-do lists and a committee meeting that stretched for 3 hours with neighborhood questions about lights and truck paths. The monitors beeped and the whiteboard filled up with notes. I slept the way mechanics do after a long job, slow and heavy because your muscles are tired of being ready. In the morning, we posted the signed terms on the office wall, a small piece of paper under a magnet that meant we had chosen direction and consequences. Once the partnership was real, the station began to find a rhythm I hadn't felt in a long time. The worksite had a schedule like a heartbeat, early checks before the sun rose, a mid-morning crew meeting with coffee and lists, and an afternoon when apprentices stayed to learn while senior techs fixed the tricky bits. The monitors gave numbers I could read, and when they blipped one afternoon, the crew paused to recheck the seal and to post the reading with an explanation in plain language. People came in with resumes folded in ways that made them look careful. They wanted work that would stick around. We awarded the first 2 scholarship letters on a windy autumn morning. One went to a welding student who'd worked at the feed store for years and wanted to learn how to make things hold. The other went to a young woman intent on applying to engineering programs who'd grown up watching tractors and wanted to translate that into something big. Maddie cheered so loud the librarian who sat beside her laughed and pretended to shush her. The whiteboard in the window became a neighborhood fixture. People stopped to read daily numbers and ask about them. The company set up a small training room with benches and basic gear, and I found myself showing local hires how to tighten a bolt without stripping it, the same way Dad had shown me. It felt like the town was reclaiming something small and vital. On the office wall, the safety logs became an almost domestic thing. Our daily air checks were posted in thick black marker with dates and a short note. Normal or action taken recheck. The community board came together and brought questions that made us better. Why that contractor? What's the path for trucks? How do we make sure our kids can get training? The oversight board's minutes were public and short, plain language and names, so people could follow who decided what and why. Over time, the company learned to answer in the same plain language, and the trust grew like a patch of grass coming back after frost. I visited Dad's grave the afternoon the first scholarship was dispersed. The stone was cool and the grass smelled like dry hay. I read him the part of the partnership about the scholarship and about safety and felt foolish, talking to a stone, except it felt right to tell him the promises we'd made. I left his red pencil on the top of the headstone for a few seconds like an offering and then slid it back into my pocket. I thought of Maddie, the question she'd asked me months ago, "Are you hurting the town?" And I felt my answer sit steady inside me. No, I wasn't hurting it. I was trying to keep it from being hurt by people who'd see it as a number. I forgave Aunt Linda quietly and kept her at my table. She came by one Sunday with a pie that had uneven crust and a face that looked relieved. We didn't fix years in a single forkful, but we ate together and that mattered. One of my brothers who'd walked away sometimes came by and left a jar of odd change on the counter, small and awkward offerings, but he didn't stay. The other took his place on a job list and learned what it meant to carry a shovel rather than just sell a render. I kept a seat open at the office for him and didn't put conditions on his meals. It felt kinder than I expected. Months later, we came back to the town hall not for a battle but for a report. I stood at the same microphone where the voicemail had once screamed and said, "We kept it clean." Karen Bolton read a short statement thanking the town for its patience and promising to keep posting tests and to fund the scholarship this year and every year as part of the agreement. Sheriff Bennett sat in the back with a look like he'd been part of the scaffolding. Ray smiled without saying much. Marla ran a piece that wasn't fanfare but a steady accounting. Jobs filled, first checks on the whiteboard, scholarship winners announced. My brothers were there at the back like figures in a painting who weren't quite sure if they belonged. One of them clapped and looked small, the other stared at the floor. I met their eyes and didn't flinch. The room felt honest that day, no loud speeches, no last-minute petitions, just a ledger of actions and outcomes. When the meeting ended, people lingered and said small things like, "Thank you," or "Good work," and that felt like the real coin of the town. Before I left, I stepped outside into the evening air and felt the smell of cut grass and diesel and a warm engine, the smells that had carried me through my life. I locked the station door with steady hands and listened to a car drive by, its driver tapping the horn in a neighborly way. Maddie waved from across the street, clutching a notebook and a pencil, and I felt a kind of peace that was noisy and practical, the kind you build with work and keeping promises. The red pencil in my pocket felt heavy and true, like a small instrument that had helped me write the story we were now living in daylight. If this story hit a nerve, tell me your family battle in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more revenge stories that end in daylight. I read every comment and I'll pull a few into the next episode to talk about.